And we're on.
Hi, everybody. Again, as I mentioned earlier, thank you all so much for joining us today for our Southwest CPC meeting. The topic for this month is the Officer Accountability Project, the other side of Law and Order Part 1, the impacts of officer misconduct, where Jonathan put this meeting together with all our panelists today. So I wanted to go ahead and call this meeting to order. It is 6 p.m. The date is Wednesday, May 5th, Cinco de Mayo. So we're going to go ahead and do the approval of the agenda. If anybody has any changes or that they would like to make to the agenda today. Is there any additions or corrections for the previous meeting?
Don't think so. They looked good. The minutes look good.
Okay.
Looks good. I move that we approve the minutes. Or excuse me, the agenda.
Yeah. Thank you so
Second.
much. I appreciate that. Awesome. All right, so going to the housekeeping. This is a webinar today, so go ahead and if you have any questions or concerns, please put them in the chat. Make your statements in there. We also have the Q&A section. If you would like to ask your questions on that section, we will have our Southwest CPC Council members stay up to date on that, so we make sure that we address them for you. And like I said, if you have any questions, please let us know as well so we can support you. Anything else, Jonathan, that I'm missing other than the chat and the Q&A?
Yeah, we just need to just quickly vote for the approval of the adoption of the agenda as printed and shown. And then we also need to just vote for the adoption of the minutes that were circulated for last month.
So do we have a motion for the approval of the agenda?
Yeah, David made it and I seconded.
Yeah, I thought David did. Okay.
I don't think there's any unreadiness, so I think we can vote.
All right. Do I hear a yay?
Yay.
Yay.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All
And I
right.
move for acceptance of the minutes as previously disseminated.
I second it.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, so we will then move forward with the accepting of the agenda and the minutes. So then we will now do the council members, the introduction of the Southwest CPC council members. Jonathan Madison,
Present.
Robbie V. Heel.
Looks like he's connecting to audio. Maybe we'll circle back to him.
All right, perfect. Andrea Lester. Looks like. All right, Wanda Harrison. Wanda's not here either. David Reza.
Here.
Thank you. Stephanie Griego. I know Chris Cedillo is here. Chris?
Here,
Awesome.
present.
All right, we're gonna go back to Robbie V. Hill. Hopefully he's connected to audio now.
Yeah, I'm here.
All right, perfect. Thank you. Okay, Jonathan, I'm gonna hand it over to you as you, made this meeting possible. And so I'll let you take over from here if that's okay.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Teresa. Appreciate it. So again, thanks for joining us, everyone that's with us. I think we have a really great, robust conversation ahead of us. And so we have titled this month's topic, the Officer Accountability Project, as Teresa mentioned, the other side of Law and Order Part 1. So this will actually be a series of 3. We'll kind of look at the impacts of not just kind of the initial interaction or arrest, but the rest of the law process. And so we really want to kind of just touch on officer misconduct. And so we have a really great list, a group of panelists that are here to kind of guide us in that conversation. And so I'll provide a couple of introductions so everyone can be aware of who these individuals are. And again, as Teresa mentioned, if you have questions, feel free to submit them to the Q&A or the chat. Robbie V. Hill, as well as the rest of the CPC council members, will be monitoring the chat. And so we'll do our best to work your questions in as we can. And so following the introductions, we'll give each of our panelists about 7 to 10 minutes to just kind of give us their perspective on the topic. to provide some additional context, and then we'll go into the Q&A. And so we'll begin with some of those introductions. So first, we have Chief Medina, Harold Medina, who's with us, the Chief of Police for Albuquerque Police Department. And so Harold Medina received his bachelor's degree with a double major in biology and criminology through the College of Arts and Sciences from the University of New Mexico. And that was in 1994. He became a first-generation college student and graduated within 4 years. And he continued his education attending the Police School of Staff and Command with Northwestern University. Chief Medina also believes in the principles that are focused on community and law enforcement partnerships. He believes that problem solving and transforming the department is the way to help create a strong bond of trust with the community. And Medina also believes in strong customer service in order to create a program based on community policing. He introduced and developed several first-time programs that emphasized outreach to local youth. He also strongly believes in working with the community to educate and have an understanding of community-oriented policing. And so Chief Medina started his police career in November of 1995 and following his graduation from the Albuquerque Police Academy. And during his career, he was a patrol officer for 9 years. He was promoted to sergeant in 2004. He was promoted to lieutenant in 2007. And in 2009, he transferred to the Property Crimes Division, where he created partnerships with community stakeholders and increased internal communications, thereby affecting double-digit reductions in property crimes throughout the city. In 2011, Medina was promoted to the rank of commander, and in 2014, he became the chief of police for the Pueblo of Laguna, and then he returned to Albuquerque in December of 2017 and was appointed deputy chief for APD. Medina was named interim chief of police in September 2020 and was thereby appointed by Mayor Keller to serve as the permanent chief of police in March of 2021. So Chief Medina, we're really happy to have you with us. Would you mind just saying hello for those that are just joining us by phone so they can associate a voice with your name?
Hello, everybody. This is Chief Medina, and thank you for having me here this evening.
Wonderful. Thanks. We're glad you can be with us. So second, we also have Mr. Sylvester Stanley, who is the Interim Superintendent of Police Reform, as well as the Deputy Chief Administrative Officer for APD. Sylvester was born and raised in Trenton, Tennessee. He entered the military at about age 17, where he enlisted in the U.S. Army. At that time, he didn't realize that this would be the beginning of a lifelong career in law enforcement because he actually began working with the military police while he was stationed overseas in Korea. He continued his military training upon his return in Fort Riley, Kansas, where his passion grew for the profession. And he then later moved to Junction City, Kansas in 1976, where he was employed with the local police department, serving initially as a patrol officer and then later moving up to detective. During that time, he attended college at night, where he completed his associate's degree in criminal justice. And in 1982, he took on a lateral entry position with the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Department, where he began his career as a patrolman, but quickly advanced to the ranks of detective, sergeant, lieutenant, and captain. And Sylvester has served as the division commander in each of the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Department's 4 divisions, which include court services, administration, field services, and criminal investigations. Mr. Stanley's professional accomplishments include everything from being a retired captain with the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Department, 43 years of law enforcement experience. He's a graduate of the Southwest Command Staff College. He has an associate's degree in criminal justice. He's a graduate of the FBI National Academy, and several more accolades. I could go on and on. But chief of these, he's also a U.S. Army Reserve retiree with 23 years of service, as well as a Vietnam veteran. And incidentally, Mr. Stanley bears the distinction of being one of only 3 African Americans who have made it to the rank of police chief in our state of New Mexico. So, Mr. Stanley, really glad to have you with us. Would you please just maybe say hello so people can associate your voice with your name if they're only joining by phone? You're muted, sir. You're muted, Mr. Stanley. Could you maybe say again, you're muted?
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. As you indicated, I'm Sylvester Stanley, and I thank you for that kind introduction, and I'm pleased to be here with you this evening.
Excellent. And our third member for the panel is Professor Emeritus of Suffolk University, as well as a former president of the National Police Accountability Project, Michael Avery. Michael began as an ACL staff lawyer during the Black Panther murder trial in New Haven in 1970. He enjoyed a career of over 4 decades as a civil rights and criminal defense lawyer. On the civil side, he represented the victims of police abuse and racial and sexual discrimination. In criminal cases, he defended people charged with everything from peaceful protesting to murder. And in Boston in 2007, he worked with a team of lawyers that obtained the largest judgment ever awarded against the FBI, a little over $101.7 million for the wrongful conviction of 4 innocent men for murder. His client, Peter Lamone, had spent 33 years in prison for a murder of which he was innocent, and that crime was later actually determined to actually be committed by an FBI informant. And so Michael Avery has served as a president of the National Lawyers Guild and is one of the founders and a past president of the National Police Accountability Project. He enjoyed a 16-year career as a law professor at Suffolk Law School in Boston, where he is now Professor Emeritus. And he's published several nonfiction books, including Police Misconduct, Law and Litigation. And in 2020, the literary Wanderlust published his first novel, The Cooperating Witness. And so he's a graduate of Yale College, as well as the Yale's School of Law. And he spent a year as an exchange student in the former Soviet Union at the University of Moscow. And after retiring as a professor of law, he obtained a Master in Fine Arts from Bennington College, and Michael now resides in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So Michael Avery, we're really glad to have you with us. Would you mind just saying hello to everyone that's joining us?
Sure, this is Michael Avery, and I'm very happy to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so I also want to make sure we do introduce and properly recognize Commander Timothy Espinosa. He's the Southwest Area Commander. Hey, Commander Espinosa, good to see you.
Good evening, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. Also, I want to recognize Ronald Kemp. He is he's with the Albuquerque, I think, Command for Criminal, I think, Crime Reduction. Can you hear us, Mr. Kemp? All right, and we also have Peter Silva with the recruiting unit for APD. So again, really glad to have all of you here with us. And so what we'd like to do, again, the topic being Officer Accountability Project, the other side of law and order. And so what I'd like to do is go in the order of introductions. So Chief Medina, I'd like to give you some like 7 to 10 minutes to just give us your perspectives in terms of officer misconduct and what are some of the challenges with resolving it and kind of where we are. And then we'll proceed to Mr. Stanley, and then we'll also go to Mr. Avery, Professor Avery, and then so we can just kind of get some context, and then we'll jump right into the Q&A.
I think officer misconduct is something that is in the forefront of the trends that we're seeing and what law enforcement is going through across the nation. We're actually going through a transformation as a profession on how we're going to treat misconduct. And I think the number one term that we could generate from this conversation is transparency. I think that in the end, it comes down to transparency and being honest. We know that we have individuals that are going to be involved in misconduct, and we must address that misconduct. But I think there also is a delicate balancing job that needs to be done by police chiefs and police leadership during these times. We have to carve out what is true misconduct and what is a performance issue. Those are two separate items. Misconduct is something that is purposeful, is something that is done to hurt an individual, and that could be metaphorically, and it is improper and shall not be tolerated. But our officers are human beings. They make mistakes. And the classic example I'll use for this is an officer who just forgets to dock their camera at a substation one time in 6-7 months. And how we treat that is going to be key for us moving forward as a profession. So I think we're really at that point where not only is the misconduct within the agency important to identify and address, but I also believe that, even our DA has taken some positive steps forward in ensuring that misconduct is captured and identified for court purposes to ensure that individuals can properly testify. And I think our state has a system where we report misconduct and the board attempts to hold individuals accountable for their misconduct and holds their certification over them as one of the means to ensure that proper behavior is accomplished. And at times they've suspended or revoked law enforcement privileges for individuals. I think that system could use some beefing up, could probably use, like any other system, governmental system, it could use additional resources and time and financial backing to ensure that we don't move a problem officer from one agency to another agency to another agency. I think that what Albuquerque is going through with the reform process is we actually are starting what most agencies are going to be starting in the near future, way before them. And I think that this is definitely the trend and the direction that law enforcement is going. But the number one reason I think all this is so important is community trust. In order for the trust of the community, we have to be transparent and honest when we make mistakes. We also have to be viewed that we hold individuals accountable, that we make sure that we continue to build that bond of trust. And that community trust needs to occur way before the morning after critical incident that is all over the newspapers. So I think this is a big topic. I'll let Sylvester get to his piece, but I think this is the one driving focus behind a lot of what law enforcement is seeing nationwide. And where we're seeing issues, I would venture to say there was already a loss of trust. And in Albuquerque itself, I can tell you, our ambassador program that we highlighted today is based to help us generate conversation and build relationships with groups of individuals in the community that haven't always had strong relationships. When you go back to what happened with APD in the past, our strongest relationships were with neighborhood associations, but only neighborhood associations. And I'm happy to say that the department is really spreading out and understanding the value of communication and working with all segments of the community.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for those starting thoughts. Mr. Stanley?
Thank you, sir. Can you hear me now? I had to adjust my mic. Okay. Thank you. I think I want to sort of reverse and pick up on something the chief finished with, to where I'll start the conversation. In this day and age, it's tough, but we in law enforcement is working hard to bring trust back between the community and law enforcement. Somewhere along the way that we've lost that trust, or the community has lost the trust in law enforcement. And it's almost like the consent decree here at Albuquerque Police Department. It didn't happen overnight, and we're not going to get it completed at night. But I think trust with community-based policing is a good way of bringing trust back to the community amongst law enforcement officers. Back in the several years ago, we used to have the DARE programs that we started in the elementary schools, teaching kids about drugs. The DARE program went away. Then the GREAT came along, and we started teaching the children about gangs involvement. That program has sort of went away from the school, but it's making a return. When I was police chief at Isleta, in Indian country, BIA has started to retrain people about DARE and having instructors to start reteaching elementary students. So that's early on with the children, with bringing trust back to the community. We have to start very young. We have to start when they start basically in kindergarten, learning to get that trust and the respect back and respect law enforcement officers. Man, when I was a child, you see a police officer and kids would stand on the corner to see the police car go by and to wave at the officers, or come up to you and have that conversation. And as you indicated in the introduction, I've been doing this a day or two. So but people have gradually gotten away from that. As Chief Medina indicated, that law enforcement officers, and we talk about the misconduct, and I tell people when we go through the process in order to be a police officer, sometimes we don't always get it right in the hiring process. Sometimes there are people that you remember, they are human beings before we become police officers. So some people have had a checkered past. Some people failed the process and escaped. I've worked with some of these people and over the 20 plus years. I've hired some of these people in some of the places I've been. But then when we identify that there is bad conduct or misconduct with those officers, we have to address it. We as managers and leaders have to address that, and you can't be afraid to address that. You know, for 3.5 years when I was the chief in Gallup in 03 to 08, I'm sorry, to 07, I have a stat that I'm not proud of, but I usually explain it to people to get this point home. In 3.5 years, I terminated 15 people. That's a terrible sign, but it's also the sign that we're not going to put up with misconduct, people lying. Most of all of those infractions that the officers probably could have maintained their job for, except for a couple, but those officers were terminated for not being truthful. That is what get officers in trouble today, and we cannot have that, because if you're not being truthful on some minor investigation, gosh, what's going to happen when you have to go to court and testify? And once there's one lie in the courtroom, you're labeled. So then it's called the Giglio effect, because then all the attorneys have to go through your whole history every time you go to court to testify, and it causes a problem. So we have to be willing to address that. There's been some administrators who have ignored that, and we can't do that. We have to hold the subordinates responsible for the sergeants and lieutenants. And that's where it started. That sergeant is probably one of the most important positions on the department, because he or she has firsthand knowledge and interaction with the patrol officer. That is who they look to. That's who they're taught to go to for direction initially. So if we have a bad sergeant, then we're going to get bad advice to the patrol officers on the bad end. So that's where commanders and chiefs and deputy chiefs, we have to be able to recognize that and identify. Chief Medina also referred to about the reports to send to Santa Fe to the Law Enforcement Academy when we have bad conduct amongst officers. That's a very important piece of paper, because if someone have bad conduct, misconduct, and they don't address it at the board, then they can get through the system for years and years. And hey, this is a partner thing. Now we're talking as a whole picture. So I'm aware of some cases there was 2 and 3 years behind before they addressed some of that disciplinary action in Santa Fe. An officer can make 3 or 4 different departments in that time. We sort of refer to them as Gypsy Cops. Now, granted, at a smaller agency, unlike Albuquerque Police Department, where we're on the verge of having 1,000 officers, if you're in some remote place like Gallup, Hickory, one of those places, you know, some departments look at those Gypsy Cops because they have a hard time getting people to apply for those jobs. So we have to do a real good job on the background investigation to make sure that one of those officers don't have a track of misconduct. And as I indicated before, and I won't keep the floor much longer, when we identify the misconduct, you have to take the action. But most importantly, we have to be honest, we have to be fair and professional about whatever action we're taking with the misconduct. You cannot single out Stanley over here and give him one treatment. Maybe give John Doe other treatments over here because maybe you like the way he looks better than you do Stanley. We have to be fair. Part of my goal is, and I try to be, first of all, professional, honest, and have integrity about whatever I do. And that is the way that I'm going to work in this assignment or this position with the Albuquerque Police Department. And hopefully at the end of the day, with the help of the men and women on the department, we will overcome this consent decree. Thank you.
Gotcha. Thank you, Mr. Stanley. Appreciate that. Appreciate that. Let's go to you, Professor Avery. Some initial thoughts around the topic of officer accountability. What do you see and what has been your experience in terms of your background and professional expertise?
Sure, thank you. First, say a happy Cinco de Mayo to everybody who's out there celebrating that. I wanted to start by just noting that there are three different ways to deal with accountability of police officers. One is through criminal sanctions for bad behavior. We almost never see that. Mr. Chauvin has been convicted in the George Floyd murder, but that's a very rare event. Police officers very seldom get charged with crimes, much less convicted of them. So criminal sanctions are not really an effective way of ensuring accountability. Secondly, proceedings within the department itself. And that's what I want to spend most of the time I have talking about today, but we'll come back to that in a minute. And the third way is civil liability, lawsuits by people who are injured by police misconduct against police officers or their departments. Now, that's what I spend most of my career doing, is bringing lawsuits based on police misconduct or writing about it when I was a professor and even before and after I was a professor. But even though that's where I spent my career, to be honest, civil liability is the least efficient and the most expensive way of trying to ensure accountability for police officers. Lawsuits take years to get through the courts. If there is any serious misconduct that resulted in serious injuries, it can cost departments and cities millions of dollars to compensate the people who've been wrongfully injured. So civil liability should be the last thing that we turn to, not the first thing. The first thing should be within the department itself. One of the questions that was circulated in advance by Dr. Madison was, what are the costs when we have a failure of accountability? And there are a lot of different costs, but I'm only going to talk about one today, and I think that one is the most important, and that is that the residents of our cities do not feel safe. They not only do not feel safe because of crime, but they don't feel safe because of these extraordinary number of incidents involving police officers who've shot and killed and injured people. I think we're in a situation right now where a majority of people in this country are coming to realize what Black and brown people and other people of color have always known, which is that it can be dangerous to confront the police. It can be dangerous to be stopped in the middle of the night if you're a minority person in this country. We're getting on a national level 1 or 2 shootings, deadly shootings every week. We have over 1,000 people a year who are shot and killed by police officers. So people don't feel safe. They not only don't feel safe, if they are subject to misconduct by police officers, then they're subjected to arbitrary punishments and injuries. So I think the first place we have to look for change is in the police departments themselves. I've been doing this for 50 years all over the country, different police departments in different states. And the one thing that I have come away with is that the single most important thing that makes a difference in how much misconduct we see in a police department is the chief, or perhaps a superintendent of police reform like Superintendent Stanley is. The top man or woman in charge sets the tone for the department. Now, I just want to talk about a few things that we know about the Albuquerque Police Department. And then I have some questions that I'd like to see Superintendent Stanley and Chief Medina address. Just 2 days ago, the latest report from the monitor, federal court monitor, in the consent decree came out. And once again, it's very critical of the Albuquerque Police Department. And it's particularly critical with regard to the use of force and whether there is discipline for the wrongful use of force. The report says the two critical tasks that the department are facing now are the use of force and discipline for violations of departmental standards. Here's the kind of thing that bothers me, and I think a lot of people who are looking at this. In this report, which is the 13th report, the monitor notes that in the 12th report, they made 12 recommendations for change to the Internal Affairs Department of the Albuquerque Police Department. 12 recommendations for change in the 12th report. And now they're making the very same 12 recommendations in the 13th report. Why? Because none of those recommendations were picked up on. And the monitor notes, the monitor says, look, you don't have to take our recommendations. You're not legally obliged to take our recommendations. But if you don't take our recommendations, you ought to be telling us what else you're doing that meet the problems that our recommendations are designed to meet. Compliance with the consent decree actually went down in the 13th period from the 12th period. Operational compliance with the report is now only 59%. 59%. One of the problems is the Internal Affairs Department, which now Superintendent Stanley is going to be in charge of. One of the problems we have in the Internal Affairs Department in New Orleans is the backlog of reports, backlog of incidents that aren't being addressed. It's like all those rape kits that were lying around in the department for years and years and years. Nobody looked at till after the statute of limitations had run, and the rapists in question could no longer be prosecuted. To a citizen outside the department, it's staggering, the idea that rape kits would sit around for that length of time. Now in this report, we find that internal affairs complaints are sitting around. According to the consent decree, they're supposed to be resolved within 90 days. Of the 298 reports that were made during this period covered by the monitor's report, only a handful were resolved within 90 days. And most of them weren't resolved even by the end of the period of time. So I think one question that I'd like to see Superintendent Stanley and Chief Medina address is, why do you have such an incredible backlog of excessive force reports that you haven't resolved? The chief was quoted in the newspaper as saying, well, officers don't want to serve in internal affairs, and he wants to hire civilians to do these investigations. So I guess my question there, I understand Superintendent Stanley's now in charge of this kind of hiring, is, are you hiring civilians? Is that a practical solution to your problem, to bring in civilians? And if not, what are you going to do to get rid of this backlog of reports that haven't been investigated? Third thing I want to bring up is the police union. Police Officers Union just launched a $70,000 campaign urging the public to demand more crime fighting and stop wasting money on the consent decree. This is a very negative approach that the union is taking, and it's not the only problem that the union has been causing. There was a petition filed with the city earlier this year. 1,200 citizens signed it, asking the city to address certain aspects of the union contract that make it difficult for the Internal Affairs Division to do its job. So my question here to the superintendent and to the chief is, what's your reaction to what the union is doing with this $70,000 campaign? What's your response to it? And when the union is saying we have to get rid of the consent decree, we have to get past the consent decree, what's your response to that? What's your response to the fact that this organized group of officers is undermining the consent decree? And the last thing I want to talk about, and this is an area where I think there's some possibility of great hope for Albuquerque, and that is the Albuquerque Community Safety Department, which was a proposal from the mayor's office that certain types of problems really don't need to be addressed by an armed police officer, but could be addressed by social workers or mental health workers or other people trained to deal with these kinds of problems. I was reading earlier today the February 23rd report from the city on the Albuquerque Community Safety Department, and they set out a timeline for fiscal year 21, January of 2021 to June 2021, during which they wanted to see a transfer of administrative functions from other departments to the Community Safety Department. They wanted to see a training plan developed, a policy and operating procedures defined, and to start hiring and onboarding and training people to perform these functions. So that's the plan. That was their plan. My question to the leadership of the police department is, what are you doing? What have you done so far, and what are you doing now to work with the Albuquerque Community Safety Department? What has the police department done to make it feasible for these other folks to do the kinds of response to calls that the police have been doing in the past? Hasn't worked out very well, neither in Albuquerque nor elsewhere in the country. Have you been training officers so that they'll be ready to work with the Albuquerque Community Safety Department? Does the Albuquerque Community Safety Department really have enough money in its budget to do this? Is this really a realistic plan? And finally, are people in Albuquerque who have a son or a daughter or a relative who's suffering from mental illness going to feel comfortable in the future calling the police department or the Albuquerque Community Safety Department for help? So that's a handful of questions that occurred to me as I was thinking about this panel tonight. And I'd really like to see the superintendent and the chief address them, not with just generalities about trust and things like that, but with some specific information for people in your community and Albuquerque in general to know exactly what we're doing to overcome the problems that Albuquerque Police Department has had in the past.
Thanks, Professor Avery. So that was quite a handful. So let's give Chief Medina and Mr. Superintendent Stanley an opportunity to kind of respond to some of these, and then we have several questions that are in the chat. We want to make sure we give the community an opportunity to ask their questions as well. So Area Commander Espinosa, also, I think you should feel empowered to join if you also want to respond. I think there were questions on several levels there.
This is Chief Medina. You want to go first, Sylvester? You want me? How do you want to do this?
Yeah, I'll go first and then let you clean it up because you have more specifics and facts. But let's talk a little bit about some of the backlog of cases. Well, even before I mention the backlogs, and it's not a cop-out, but prior to my arrival, one of the things that we're addressing, one of the things the chief is addressing, and some of those units before we got on board or as we're getting on board, I think some of the problems were that we didn't have permanent commanders in those positions. We were going through people that maybe not had a buy-in to the process of what we were doing. It's not an excuse, but I'm just trying to tell you what probably happened and where we're at. And then I'll tell you what we're trying to do about it to correct some of that stuff. there was a shortage of officers, and IA is broken down into a force unit and to the professional standards unit. And we had a shortage, as was stated, of officers wanting to work internal affairs force cases. There was no officers. It became a time when officers felt they did not want to investigate other officers, and they were not putting in for those assignments. Yes, we did post for civilian positions. Yes, those positions have just closed. We are in the process of hiring the first 11 civilian investigators. Those interviews will take place next week. And then we will go from there. Then we will have to train those individuals and bring them up to standard. But we feel very confident that we can train those individuals and that they'll be able to do the investigations or to assess. And we have, yes, you're right. We have a backlog of some cases. We missed some timetables, some time zones on those, but we have to go and complete those anyway. That will be done. The other thing that, and I'll comment on the union thing later, that we have to do and still try to meet the requirements of the Justice Department, the monitors, and we're trying to be in compliance with all of those. You know, they've asked us to go outside and bring in some internal trainers, professionals from other areas. We were sort of directed to do that. That's in the process. We will be bringing on the EFIT team to come in to assist us with that training and case preparation and to make sure we're making those deadlines appropriately. Now, you talked about this here was in the MR 11 and 12 and 13, all before our time. I would ask you guys to look at 14 and 15 when they come out, and let's have the same conversation, because we will have had some input one way or the other into that process. One of the things that we're trying to do that we're going to get there is select commanders who will work in those positions or command those units on a permanent base, and we're almost there. So we're not rotating commanders. That was a big fallacy to my understanding in reviewing some of the information and talking to the commanders who are there temporarily. There was no stability. Just like anything in life, you got to have stability and make sure that those people or investigators in this case are properly trained to do the job and follow through. And that's what we're doing. One of the other things in that report that came out about some shortcomings in training, the same issue. We're addressing that. We just graduated 45 cadets from training, and we have 56 in training now as we speak. And there's 3 other classes slated for later on this year. So we're recruiting people, we're training them, but hopefully we're getting permanent people. And as we sit in here, we're in the process of interviewing a permanent director of the training academy with the training background. And so that will assist us in going forward. With this new position that the city have taken, was splitting up some of the functions of the police department between the chief and I think that's going to be really great. I think it's going to help the chief and I communicate every day, but we still have 2 specific roles. You talk about disciplinary action and conduct. Well, I have the responsibility for having the final stop on disciplinary action. That stuff will land on my desk. The chief is not involved in that. So we will address those as it's coming through. And I will say this, for a short period of time, and obviously those were definitely old reports, because I can tell you there's definitely been some disciplinary action that's been coming across my desk. Now, that probably won't be all public until 14 and 15. The fact that we've stepped up the pace. And with that, I'll yield and allow Chief Medina to continue.
That's a great question. And, we'll get as specific as we can, but if we were to get into specifics of the document, the size of the document, we'd probably still be here tomorrow morning discussing the particulars and the specifics of this. I hate to be a little general, but I'm going to lay this foundation. And it is about laying a foundation. In order for us to move forward, we have to lay the foundation with the proper processing and process map what we're trying to accomplish. That's not a recommendation only of Harold Medina. That's a recommendation of the monitoring team that we had to develop processes. And it may slow the process down, but once we develop a good process, then we plug the pieces into the process. We knew that there was a shortage of force investigators since December. It took from December till now for us, number one. It may sound easy to an individual who's never worked in government, but to hire 11 civilian investigators, you must first develop a job description. And that's going to take HR a period of time. And after they develop that job description, which talks about the specifics of how you're going to hold individuals accountable to work product, what they're going to be compensated, we have to find a funding source. We were in the middle of a financing year, so to speak, and we had to transfer certain positions to cover those salaries and benefits for those individuals. And I think it comes somewhere to the tune of about $900,000, almost $1 million. And after that, you have to advertise. So it gets advertised for a period of time. Applications come in. Once these applications come in, they need to be reviewed. And we're at the point where next week, these individuals are going to be hired. We did have community conversations with some of our stakeholders who are very engaged and know each step of the direction we're moving. And they liked this concept for a number of reasons. It brings in outside individuals who haven't worked with officers their entire career. So they hope and they feel that they're going to be more able to hold people accountable because there's not long-term relationships with that. At one point in time, they asked that we could possibly force people to stay in the unit. I don't think that is very productive. We could have forced patrolmen second class because that's what our CBA says would have to be forced first. But I don't think the answer is a brand new officer going and being forced there till they turn patrolman first class. And then we have to get a brand new patrolman second class into the position, retrain them. And just as they're getting the experience and getting real good, guess what? They turn to patrolman first class and we start all over. So we made the decision after thinking about it of going with external investigators the way we're going. The unit also needed to grow to 25. A lot of times, a lot of the recommendations is staff up the academy, staff up force, staff up professional standards. As the chief of police, it's my job to balance that. Because although on one side, everybody that wants police reform, there's also a big part of the community that wants a safe community. And as chief, it's my job to ensure that we move forward in both areas. And I think that's key, is that we have to be a police department that has legitimacy within the community. And that legitimacy comes through constitutional policing. And it also comes through creating a safe community that people think the officers are out doing their job, keeping them safe. So there's a lot of decisions that go into just that one aspect that we talked about, the increase in force investigations. One of the other topics is we talk about recommendations. We're on the 13th monitoring report. Harold Medina retired in 2014, returned in December of 2017 as the deputy chief of the field. my primary focus at that point was field response, community partnerships, working with the community, and reducing property crime rates. We've had 3 years of double-digit property crime reductions. Well, 2 years, 18, 19, and 23 years. We've also had this year our early indications of a 25% decrease in property crimes. We are struggling with homicide, but we were one of 3 cities, major cities, that had a homicide reduction last year. And it's this balancing for a chief that needs to occur. You have to do all of these at the same time. As for reducing the amount of force, we did develop a new use of force policy, and there are 4 tiers to that training that are essential. If they weren't all essential, I don't think the training would have been approved in the way that it was approved. We never got to conduct the 4th tier of the training because of COVID. There's been criticism that our academy should have ran COVID forward, ran training and modified training. I think it's very complex, and it's more than that. And one area that I'll always push back on to defend our officers is the fact that nowhere in the report, the consideration of COVID and its impact on a country, the whole world, was taken into account. And that's a key piece for me that was left out, because I do remember in the fall when we had up to 150 officers at a time out for COVID. I do remember when we had training sessions and everybody involved in that training ended up with COVID. So there was a lot of caution and a lot of careful actions that were taken, because that was the big elephant we had in the room last year. I believe that laying this foundation and looking that we're working on a lot of the exact recommendations they've told us is key. And as chief, I'm not working on those recommendations. I have teams that are working on those recommendations, but it is my job to ensure accountability, that those recommendations are being looked at and the process is going forward. Every Friday, a different group comes in and gives an update on their paragraphs to ensure that we're moving all our paragraphs to go from the 2nd level to the 3rd level, because all of our 1st level has been met. So we're consistently looking at, but at times I do have to make tough decisions. That homicide is going to grow to 16 detectives and 2 sergeants, and force may not get all the individuals they need, because I want to make sure that the families who have lost a loved one to homicide get justice. And that is a responsibility I'm willing to take. And I recognize it may keep 52 people happy and it may upset 48 people. But I have to do what I know is best for this department. I have to rely on 26 years of experience, knowing this department and knowing how I'm going to balance the future, not just for the Albuquerque Police Department and the reform process, but for every individual who goes out every day with the expectation that they do not want to be a victim. Like I stated earlier, it's a balancing act. And every day, deputy chiefs, there's not one deputy chief that's not asking for additional resources where I have to say, no, the next priority is this. And we will continue through that until we're able to get our recruiting numbers up. There's a lot of recommendations that come in that are unfeasible. Giving resources is the number one I use. I just don't have the resources to give everybody everything that is required. The next one is there's a lot of criticisms with the number one issue I hear with the union is why don't you take sergeants and lieutenants out? They're protected by state law, and our labor attorneys could explain it very easily why we can't do that. And we answer that question over and over. But it's at the forefront of what some of the concerns are. Some of the other concerns are, why can't you change the contract and give you bigger, longer timeframes? It's a contract. It means 2 people have to agree. Generally, for that to happen, a large sum of financial compensation needs to be given towards the contract in order for somebody to give up something important. We are in the midst of COVID. It has an effect on our gross receipt tax, the money's coming into the city, and our ability to put financial compensation into a future contract. So all these topics are very, very complex, and we could get into very, very specifics on all these topics. And there is answers and responses from the administration as to why we're here. Sylvester Stanley brought it up earlier. There was a mention in the monitor's report that sometimes discipline that should have reached 8 to 24 hours wasn't imposed. They gave a letter. This has to do a lot with commanders, because one thing is a lot of the discipline that goes up through the chain of command from professional standards through deputy chiefs in the chief's office, we are within that matrix. Commander Cottrell is looking to ensure that we're at 95%, because nobody has that measurement of 95%. It's based off of random sample of 20 out of, or 30 cases out of 1,000 maybe. And that is very problematic when you have such a small sample and such a large number of cases. So we're looking to develop the tracking and the information to see where that is. But this is what I want to say about the progressive discipline and our officers is our officers also deserve to be treated fairly. I'm all about accountability. I've probably terminated more officers during the course of my career than anybody who's ever sat in the seat of deputy chief or chief of this department. And it's nothing I'm proud of, but it's something that needed to be done. But there are also a lot of good officers. And the thing I always say is a 7 is not a 7 is not a 7. And if anybody does not understand what I just said, everybody should use caution then in judging what we're being gauged on in terms of progressive discipline. Because a 7 is a class violation, a verbal reprimand. And the way our policy is written right now, if an officer misses court and then within that year, that officer also doesn't dock his camera into the substation one time out of all the shifts they work, and that officer then is complained upon and is rude to a citizen one time in a whole year, our progressive discipline process says that officer is subject to an 8 to 32 hour suspension, when all those violations generally are verbal, but all three compounding over a year equal 8 to 32 hours. And it's that 8 to 32 hours that sometimes hurts the morale of this police department, because it's some of those. I gave you 3 examples that may not be misconduct. I worked graveyard for 14 years. I missed court because there were several times that I overslept and I was just too tired to get to work. And you know what? Sometimes situations get the better of us and we react in an inappropriate, unprofessional manner. But we will be held accountable for those to the proper level. And sometimes people may forget to dock their camera. Should that result in 18 to 24 hours of loss of pay? And for somebody who's on the last 3 years of their career, that affects their retirement for the rest of their life. So that's where we're not complaining about it. We're working to change the policy. In October, we began the process of changing the policy where it's not so harshly progressive and where we distinguish between misconduct and mistakes, work performance. If everybody on here who works for an employer, if every mistake you made at work progressively got to a point, how many people here would be facing 8 to 32 hours of suspension? The officers are critiqued very harsh in a lot of ways, and it's deservingly in use of force to make sure that it's appropriate. But it's these mistakes in work performance that really leads to commanders having that concern for morale and officers who want to be productive in work and not hitting them for something that they don't believe should hit 8 to 32 hours. And a matter of fact, several individuals involved in this process, when I first came back, said we over-discipline people because of that progressive nature. I wasn't chief before. I am chief now. And that was one of the first things I began to change. But you look, the parties are just getting our final version of that SOP change this week. It took us from October till now to get that done. And part of it is there are only so many hours in a day. There's somebody on this phone call, Lindsay Van Meter, our attorney. There's nobody I have more respect for. This lady works more than anybody I know for this process. What people don't see is there's times she's still calling me at 8 o'clock at night. Chief, I need your approval for this. Look at your email. There's only so many hours in a day and it takes time. And I'm sorry that we're 6 years into this process, but let's not lose sight. I think Seattle's at 16. I think Portland is well above 14. Oakland's well above 14. I think LAPD once took 20. So there is a lot more to this. And I really hope that the general public will get very educated on the exact topics and know that we are going to struggle and we are going to continue to build processes where we in hope that we get better and better. And I'll tell you, it's not just APD that works so hard. You know, Elizabeth Martinez is on here. She is somebody we reach out to. She works weekends. She works evenings. Everybody involved in this process, from APD, the Justice Department, the monitoring team, works long, hard hours to try to get the department in where they're going. But it's not a process that can be corrected overnight. I know I may have not gotten to some of your specifics. There's a big report. But if you have any specific questions about a specific topic, I'll answer it. But go a little slower because I didn't have a pen when you started. And I hope I hit them all. But it is very, very complex. And it is very difficult. And we are working to get to that point. It just takes time. And sometimes, unfortunately, time is something that we're not always granted. Right. But I will say this, one last thing is, in the last 3 years, when's the last time you saw the Albuquerque Police Department in the newspaper for anything eerie close to what you're seeing across the nation? We have some that are still being investigated, but there has been drastic improvement in the lawsuits that we've paid out over the past 6 years.
So I'm going to jump in there. So Chief Medina and Superintendent Stanley, thanks for those responses. And also Professor Avery, thanks for those questions. Actually, there was several comments in the chat that said that's exactly what people wanted to have asked and hear about. So what I really want to do is let's kind of go. I want to go a lot faster. I want to get several questions from the community because there have been several asked, and we want to try to get some of those some airtime. So Robbie, can you maybe kind of provide some of those questions so we can have an opportunity to hear from the community and get their questions answered?
Yeah, so we had a question from Radama. She says, thank you for this opportunity to share. How can the community, especially ones of color, help the police department create a mutual environment of safety, communication, and respect? What do you need from us?
You know, I think one of the things that we could do and work together is our ambassador program. If you're not familiar with it, our ambassador program is really about us building relationships with those groups that haven't always had positive relationships with the law enforcement community. It is imperative that every voice is heard. You kind of touched about this in my bio. And sometimes I say this, you know, I shouldn't be here. I'm a first generation college graduate. I'm a first generation police officer. I had my share of obstacles in life in general and during my career, but I kept working hard to get there. And for me, it wasn't just an easy process. And that's kind of how I reflect some of the community members that we have from groups that aren't always well represented or had a good history with police. It's really hard for you to build those relationships. So working with our ambassador program, if you get your information to Commander Espinosa, we will have an ambassador reach out to you and see how we could work with individuals from your community, because the goal is take that training that we learn with you and your culture, bring it back, teach the rest of the department, and have you help us recruit from your community group so that we can build a department that looks like our community.
So I'll jump in here also. Chief Medina and Sylvester Stanley, you guys both mentioned these ideas around transparency and these ideas around honesty. And we know also, as you mentioned, Chief Medina, that several of these things are couched in law and process and policies, which can't be changed overnight per se. But I think one thing that's really tied to accountability and transparency is, kind of access to information. And so we do know that just across the nation that police misconduct are kind of guarded and held at different levels across kind of different states, right? And so New Mexico is one of 15 states, I believe, that has limited access to that type of information when there's misconduct. What do we know, or is there any efforts to make misconduct records public, or information that is available to the public, so we can really advance this idea of transparency and honesty?
I think the DA took a first step in that. DA Torres, he created a system. It goes back to Superintendent Stanley spoke about with Giglio. It is one of the first in the state. This jurisdiction for the second judicial district, we have a process where officers are asked certain questions that he is going to be posting online, stating whether an individual has had something that would bring him into Giglio in terms of being able to testify. The police department, we're very transparent in the number, but there is also that balancing act, once again, that we need to accomplish is there's also rights that individuals are given. Officer Bill of Rights don't allow us to release everything we'd like to during internal investigations, and sometimes it's not appropriate. So there is that balancing act. At times we've released possibly more than we generally would, given the circumstances and given the magnitude of it. But it's a process that needs to continue to be refined. There needs to be communication. And this goes back to what I was talking about earlier. And it's like my biggest, issue right now on the crime side is I need a criminal justice system that communicates, and we need to make some changes. Like there has to be that line in the sand where we say, this person stays in jail. We just have to as a community. But at the same time, on the other side, we need the system to start working and communicating together in terms of police reform. I think, we're very lucky in sense that, I feel very comfortable picking up the phone and calling, somebody from DOJ and saying, hey, how do we get through this? I check in with the monitor and say, hey, are we doing okay? Where do you see us needing to make some adjustments? But other agencies aren't held to the same standard. And it does make it a little difficult for us as the one agency held to this standard in the state, because it gives officers the ability to say, I'm going somewhere else where it's easier and there's not as much accountability. So I really wish that, and I hope that all of us can work together to ensure that we have the same standard through all law enforcement across the state, so that individuals can't feel the heat in one place and decide to go somewhere else.
Gotcha.
Does that answer your question?
A little bit. I think it provides a little bit of color to it. Yeah. So Robbie, can you maybe get another question from the chat? I think there's been several that have been asked and some that were asked much earlier.
Yeah, it looks like a few of them would have been answered by the original response, but we do have another question. And just looking at you mentioned the ambassador program. Is there any plans to work with the CPC on or with the ambassador program?
We could recommend that ambassadors participate and work on CPCs. I think Kelly sent the CPC schedule to some members from Black New Mexico movement recently that are becoming interested, and we'll continue. Tomorrow, I'll make sure that our lieutenant in charge of the ambassador program just kind of makes available and make sure we have a briefing with all the officers so they can go out and explain the CPC process and see if we could bring in these members. The reason I think that would be really important and beneficial to us is I think it could really assist us in adding diversity to our CPCs across the city. So definitely going to be looking into that and seeing how we could get them to be more active participants in the CPCs. Great,
All right.
great recommendation.
Thank you.
It's kind of what I took it as.
Getting back on track here. So another question we had was what level of misconduct gets just reported to the law enforcement board in Santa Fe? Are departments or is specifically APD required to consult the board's records when hiring? Or what does that process look like?
And
We have
Chief Medina, so yeah, actually, if I can, I don't know if Sylvester Stanley is still with us, but if since disciplinary things go to his desk, I don't know if he can respond. And I'd like to maybe add to the question, Professor Avery, just in terms of actually getting one of the kind of results of kind of either the punitive consequences or proceedings within the police department or civil liability. Like, are there any specific structures that have been shown to be more effective in terms of the records of misconduct actually being reported up the chain? So the first question, Mr. Stanley, what level of misconduct gets reported to the law enforcement board in Santa Fe? And then Professor Avery, are there any particular models of reporting that have been shown to be more effective in terms of who those misconduct files and reports go to?
Well, I hope you can still hear me.
We can hear you.
Recharging my batteries, so that's why you can't see me. But all levels is scheduled to be reported to Santa Fe, and they've just recently changed that under state law, what is required. But when officers involved in excessive use of force, domestic violence, if they are arrested for some misconduct, the Law Enforcement Academy takes that stuff and they review it. And then there's a panel of police chiefs and other members around the state that when they go before the hearing and they decide if that officer's certification is suspended or not, or if they're scheduled to go on. Law enforcement agencies are able to contact Santa Fe and find out if a particular officer, if he's applying for a lateral position, if his certification is still good or if he's not. So that cuts out some of that Gypsy Cop stuff. People just going from one agency to another agency with a bad record. So as we're doing this stuff, we're required to check with Santa Fe to find out if that certification is still good. Hopefully I answered your question.
I think so. Professor Avery, can you provide some other suggestions? You're muted, sir. You're muted. Michael, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I think you asked a very good question. I wish I knew the answer to it. I'm not aware of any model jurisdiction with regard to keeping track of officer misconduct in the past so that you can avoid the kind of problem that the chief was talking about where officers go from department to department. I had a journalist from New York call me yesterday about a case in which somebody who'd been terminated by the FBI based on allegations that he had raped somebody at knife point was subsequently hired by the Alabama State Police as a trooper and is now charged with raping someone in Alabama using his ability as a trooper to do that. So this is a problem. This is a national problem. And it's one that even affects federal agencies like the FBI. But I don't know if there's any jurisdiction that has a model approach to resolving it. I would like to hear, Chief, you said I went very fast before, and I apologize for that, but I would like to hear what the department is doing to get ready to work with the Albuquerque Community Safety Department with regard to calls involving mentally ill people or similar problems that maybe we can address without sending armed officers out to deal with them.
And I would add, there was also a comment in the chat from Dennis Foltz, who kind of echoed that request, and he specifically asked, is there a goal-based timeline for some of these items, particularly how and when we'll work with these other agencies that have kind of been outlined and communicated as helping.
The chief is mute now.
You're muted, Chief.
Going to be the tagline of 2021, you were on mute. I think, our city attorney is on here. She could give some examples of how it's working. But one of the biggest things that I think the city did in order to help have a smooth transition is we have an individuals who's helping us tie in policies. And, this goes back to my concept of developing a good, strong foundation. And then from that foundation, start to building off it. And I think the first foundation is developing those policies. One recently that just came up is our work with encampments and ensuring that the work that the role of APD is in line with what everybody else is doing and what the social service departments are doing. So we do have an individual who's working to gap these policies in place. But I think this also goes back to the culture of the police department. And the culture has to be working and setting the expectation from the top that we work well and communicate and respect other people's positions and authorities in situations that have more authority over us. And I think that's about building that model where we work in partnership and we don't try to dominate the relationships and we're able to talk through issues. Our CIT program, for example, they work quite extensively with the community safety department, and they're trying to figure out means to go forward to ensure that we have the proper response to situations and who we dispatch, when we dispatch. Some of these questions even go beyond the police department and the community safety department. Down and outs, this is another situation that we see quite frequently across the city. It's a big burden on us as a police department. And this is a conversation that is occurring between police, fire, and the community safety department. But in a lot of these areas, we're also bringing in community stakeholders that can assist us. We have programs such as Heading Home that assist the homeless with long-term solutions. So also making sure that not only APD is on the same page, the city's community safety department is on the same page, but also making sure we're pulling in all the stakeholders and all the community partners that are also going to assist us. Because neither one of us, whether it be APD or the community safety department, is going to be able to solve the issues. We still need the community stakeholders to be plugged into so many of these bigger term solutions. And I think the last thing I'd want to say is the reason I support this department wholly and just think it is completely the way we need to go in the future is I always use the analogy of think of a teacher on the school ground and we tell kids, go to that teacher for help. And then we put that teacher in the middle of the school ground with a rifle hanging off their chest. How insane is that? Well, just think about it. We're telling mentally ill people, go talk to the officer armed with a gun in the uniform. And then we wonder why, sometimes things go bad or they're afraid to go ask for help. We got to get the right people out there and make sure that the right people are responding to the right calls. And the last thing I'll say is at 22 years old, I got dispatched to help a family that couldn't control their 9-year-old. I probably did more damage to that kid and that family than I ever could have imagined because I didn't have no kids and I had no business giving parenting advice. And we have to make sure our officers aren't getting dispatched to these types of situations because we simply are the wrong tool for the situation.
Well, I'm very glad to hear you say that, Chief.
Yeah, agreed. So there's several more questions in the chat. And so Robbie, I think, is going to give us some more of them. And I just want to interject one because Chief Medina, you mentioned something about community stakeholders and partners. And I think one thing that I've heard all evening is this item of trust, right? You have to have a foundation of trust, and trust has to be there before the morning after, a very public and heinous incident. And Professor Avery's kind of mentioned that many Black and brown communities don't have a lot of trust for officers, just given everything that's happening in terms of what we're seeing. So to Mr. Stanley, there was a question in the chat, particularly around Noble. I know that you're a member of the National Organization of Black Law Officers, law enforcement officers. Has there been any study done by Noble around officer misconduct and how to improve the relationship and the perception of the community, particularly Black and Brown communities, with police?
Well, Noble is I'm almost certain. I don't know if it's the most recent policy with Noble, but I'm certain that they have some policies and they've been doing some research on this particular issue around the country. As the chief mentioned earlier, and this thing is definitely not going away, just not here in Albuquerque. As you know, Louisville, Kentucky just went under the Justice Department. And there's been 2 or 3 in the last month, or 2 or 3 other departments just going around. So Noble is definitely bringing information to the table with people of color who are police chiefs to assist them in managing the department. I have not reached out to Noble since I've been in this assignment here. As we travel down this road, as you know, it's just been about 5 or 6 weeks. We will continue. We will definitely reach out to the Noble partners to assess. But one of the things, because the Justice Department have set that direction for us, and when we have the monitors, I have to be real careful because I don't want it to look like that I'm trying to go against some of that direction has been put out. So we'll have to get those guys to bite off and sign off on the policies that Noble has come out with. But Noble is always writing different policies and new policies, and they assist many agencies around the country that is willing to take that advice. It's a great organization.
I will just interject one more item, and then because I just think it's aligned with this theme that Chief Medina is mentioning around kind of partnership and trust and building trust. Rada Moss asked if recognizing that there are segments of communities that don't feel safe with police presence and acknowledging the tenor in our country. This question is directed to you, Chief Medina. Have you considered reaching out to some of those communities to introduce yourself as an initial and powerful outreach strategy? You're muted, sir. You're muted, Chief.
Geez, that mute button is going to get me today. No, that's the essence of our ambassador program. And when I became interim chief, the very first Saturday, I made probably one of the best but most difficult phone calls I had to make. Over the course of the summer, we had gone through months upon months of protests and demonstrations and a couple riots. And during this whole time, there had become a very adversarial relationship between an individual known as Tayberry and APD. That's all you heard on the radio. Tayberry's there. Tayberry's there. And he organized a lot of these big protests. When I became interim chief that first Saturday, I asked somebody to track me down a phone number for Tayberry. And I called him. And me and that young man talk multiple times a week. He was sitting behind me today as we announced the ambassador program. He has supported me. It's funny because when I got appointed chief, my daughter was watching it live stream, and there's always the haters and the trolls, and they were saying their parts, and he was defending me tooth and nail on that sheet. And my daughter goes, "Look, Dad, Tay is just defending you tooth and nail." But we developed an understanding, and he works with us now. And he's made the decision that this is about moving forward and working together. And that is just one example. We also reached out to the Asian community and worked with the Asian community. And recently, when the topics of Asian persecution came out, we had already had relationships, and it was just a matter of calling a meeting to let them know that we support them. And when we showed up to an event on Civic Plaza, I showed up to a group of individuals that I had been working with, which made it a whole lot easier. And the whole concept with the ambassador program is working with those groups that you don't always work with. Racism, Burka Against Racism is another group, Mike Silva, that we've reached out to work with. And we've had town halls, and we're going to have a series of them through all the area commands, 2 per area command. And I recommend that you listen in and get part of the conversation. Pastor Walker, Harold Bailey, are the two individuals that are moderating them, and they do a great job in moderating them. Yesterday was the first one, and it really brings a light and it starts those difficult conversations that need to occur. But I think the one thing law enforcement needs to remember is when I went out to the Pueblo of Laguna, it taught me this better than anywhere else ever taught me in the city. The tribal communities, they do not trust the United States government about something that happened 200 years ago. And I see why. I worked out there. I saw the living conditions. I see how as a community, sometimes the effects of way back then are still carrying over now. And as I talked to individuals from the Black community, I really learned, and it reminded me that same ongoing history that we have to work to overcome. So it's going to take a lot of conversation, meaningful conversation, a lot of tough questions of the chief. And like I said, I'm used to tough questions. I'm okay with them. And honesty and forgiveness at times. And I've told Tay and Torrance this all the time, two members of the Black Mexico movement, is I could have an officer do something completely that just blows my mind tonight, but it doesn't mean that it changes our relationship. It means I hold that officer accountable and we only start to work more because there's more work that needs to be done.
Very good. So there was a question that was asked by Senator Pope, State Senator Pope, District 23, and he asks around law and legislation. So we do know that New Mexico has been the second state, I believe, to actually, through House Bill 4, pass a bill that effectively ends qualified immunity as a defense for wrongdoing on the part of officers. Senator Pope asked, is there any other legislation that we can pass or that we can work on that will help us, move forward together in a more productive way, in a more trusting way? And I'd like to actually ask Professor Avery to maybe respond to that one, since you do have the law degrees.
Well, first of all, I'm very proud of the fact that we passed House Bill 4 here in New Mexico. Qualified immunity is a terrible doctrine that has made it very difficult for people all across the United States to get justice and compensation for violation of their constitutional rights. And we've now gotten rid of it here in New Mexico, and I think that's a very good thing. There's another bill that was in the legislature. I believe it was House Bill 227, but I don't necessarily hold me to that bill number, that spoke in more substantive terms about what police should be doing, particularly with regard to use of force. And one of the key concepts in that bill was the concept of de-escalation, which I know both Superintendent Stanley and the chief are very much aware of the conversations that are taking place across the country right now about de-escalation and mandating de-escalation before there can be an escalation in force. So I think that bill is probably going to be brought forward in the next session of the legislature. I've talked with people who are working on that bill, and I'm prepared to help them to the extent that I can. And there have been several bills like that across the country. In fact, I noticed on your resume, Superintendent Stanley, that, and maybe the chief is also your member of the International Association of Chiefs of Police. I'm an academic member myself, and I noticed that every week, and sometimes twice a week, we get an email talking about legislation that's pending in various not only state legislatures, but also city councils across the country. So there's quite a bit of interest, not just here in New Mexico, but nationally, with making some changes that can be accomplished through legislation, whether it's ending certain practices like chokeholds or things like that, or whether it's more general philosophy about de-escalation and other matters like that.
Yes, sir. You're absolutely right. And I want to thank the senator for offering that helping hand. And I'm sure we will be reaching out, or the department will be reaching out with Senator Pope at a later date and continue that conversation offline. if I could just, I want to just add something here. And you guys read all those nice things on the introduction. Well, one of the things I want to, because sometimes, and I'm not saying everybody, but sometimes when we come to these meetings, I get a feel, that people think we're just coming up and blowing hot smoke and not giving them the true fact. And the chief has been truthful and I've been truthful. My resume started off of my childhood, started telling you about my adult life. I was in the military. What it doesn't tell you that I was in the first class of integration in high school, and I've been on both sides of this coin. And it's very important to me that whatever community that I'm serving in, that I can try to do to the best of my ability to make sure all the citizens of all colors are treated equally and fairly by the men and women, since all of my adult life has been in law enforcement. So that works for me in whatever capacity. But I thought that was very important to let your listening audience to know that, yes, I hear what you're saying when you talk about, I've been mistreated by police officers in some jurisdictions as I was a police officer. As a Black young man in the first class of integration in high school, I've had it mistreated by the whole system, but it didn't just keep me down there at the bottom of the world. I went on to try to make those changes as we could. Here I am continuing to try to do this in law enforcement to lay some major changes. And now I've landed a position in police reform. And I think it's very important. I have 7 grandchildren. I have 2 sons. And so we've all went down that path, and I understand that, and I can feel the pain. But I just thought, as I'm sitting here listening to some of this, I just thought it was very important that I share that much. And I know I got off key a little bit, but I wanted to share that with the group. But thank you for allowing me to have that couple minutes.
Absolutely, Superintendent Stanley. I think I think I speak for all of us when I say we really appreciate your time, as well as your willingness to engage us in these conversations. And let's be frank. This is a delicate and complex scenario. It didn't happen last night. It didn't happen yesterday. And it takes time to unravel these things and to build trust. And so we really appreciate you, Chief Medina and Superintendent Stanley, as well as Professor Avery, for being with us to lead us in this conversation, because I think we're certainly not trying to structure a gotcha moment. We're really trying to engage in how do we help, right? And how do we help us all move forward together? And so I think you all have embodied that philosophy and that thought even tonight. And so we really appreciate not just your time, but also the job that you do, because you all the officers, you all put your lives literally on the line every day that you go to work. And so that is not lost on us. And so, above all, we also want to say thank you, for the job that you all do day in and day out. And we're here to work with you so that we all can, be safe and come home at night, yourselves included. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we are at time, and we did our best to try to get through as many questions as we possibly could. But we realized, I think there's maybe a couple of comments that we weren't able to field. Chief Medina and Superintendent Stanley, and also Professor Avery, I don't want to do it for you, but if you're comfortable and you'd like to leave your contact information in the chat for any questions that we didn't get to, if people want to direct those to you specifically, we would invite you to do that. If others feel more comfortable, you can always email us at abq.southwest.cpc@gmail.com. We'll work on getting our City of Albuquerque one set up properly and forwarded, but we're happy to relay those questions for you as well. And also, as we close, I just want to leave you with the call to action for this month. So we're trying to tie a call to action to each of our topics of discussion. And today's call to action is actually related to the Innocence Project. And so I think something that I've heard from every person today is that honesty and transparency is key, right? You can't have trust without it. And so the Innocence Project is an activity and an effort focused on trying to make officer records, particularly as it relates to misconduct, public record. So if you would like to add your name to the list of persons that are also advocating and hoping for accountability and clarity in terms of police records across all 50 states, that there's a link in the chat. And so you're more than welcome to add your name to that general request. And also, as a preview of next month, we're going to continue this this series, The Other Side of Law and Order, and hopefully we'll have someone from the District Attorney's Office with us just to talk about what begins to happen after, the interaction with the police on the front end and what needs to happen on the back end to ensure dangerous people get off the street, and ways that we can help make that happen and aid the police in their work and not be impediments to it. And so with that, I will turn it back over to Teresa, our chair. If there's any other final comments that you wanted to make, I wanted to give you the opportunity, but then also for Mr. Stanley and Chief Medina, and then Professor Avery, is there any other last comments, please, 30 seconds or less, that you wanted to make? And then we'll go ahead and close today's meeting.
Just thanks for having us here.
Thanks for having us, and appreciate it the evening.
Same here. Thank you very much.
Same here. Appreciated it. It was a good conversation.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much for taking the
Thank
time,
you.
like Jonathan said, to be here today. It really means a lot for us and the community that we serve. There was something that Kelly had posted earlier about the foothills, and so if you would like to join that, Kelly, if you don't mind, can you please repost that just in case? So if it got maybe lost in the chat. Other than that, are there any more announcements and or business that we need to discuss within our council? I think that's it.
I would just make the comment that I think all area command CPCs would be interested in new membership. There can't be enough community engagement, as this is obviously a really, big, thing in our community, right? Our police force and how we interact with them. And so if we want to move the needle, we kind of have to be willing to put in a little bit of sweat. So the foothills is certainly interested in new membership, but I think all the CPCs are more than happy to have more civilians engaged.
Yeah, absolutely. Same with us. If you guys would like to join, email us, and we would love to have your application and have you guys join us. All right.
Hello. I could really quick.
That's terrible. I meant to write, of course, Southwest. But, all councils right now are looking for people who would like to serve on the council, help the community, and definitely apply. It takes about 10 to 12 hours a month, a couple of meetings, a couple of projects, and you can get involved in this project. Please, the Southwest Council meets on the first Wednesday of every month, right? So I get a little confused sometimes with the 6 of them, but we're doing excellent work, as you can see. Please pass this link on to your friends, your family, and your neighbors. This is important work here.
And also, Commander Espinosa, Southwest Area Commander, wanted to also give you the same opportunity. If they had any closing comments, 30 seconds or less, we certainly wanted to give you the opportunity to speak.
Yeah, I want to thank everybody, especially Professor and the Superintendent, the Chief, for being here, taking time out of their busy schedules to address everybody. And I think it was a good conversation. And I just want to make a quick announcement on a lighter note, kind of change the subject. On May 15th, our youth leadership program and our APD lowrider program that we're working with the youth is going to have a drive-through car show at Balloon Fiesta grounds. I'm going to put out a post in our newsletter. If you all could please pass it along. It's been a few years. It's been a great project that we've been doing. We're looking forward to, we're still working with the community that we've worked with in order for these programs to be effective. It has to go both ways, and we're really looking forward to a nice event. So keep your eyes and ears open. May 15th at around noon, there's going to be a drive-through car show event at Balloon Fiesta grounds with an unveiling of a pretty cool lowrider from APD with the community. So other than that, I don't have anything else. Thank you all. I hope you guys have a good evening.
Thank you so much. And don't forget to follow us on social media. We do have a Twitter account and a Facebook account. So please add us there where you all can get the registration link as well for our future meetings. So with that being said, can I ask for a motion to adjourn this meeting today?
I move for adjournment.
All right. All right, then if there is no further business for the Southwest CPC, then the meeting stands adjourned at this time, being 7:39 p.m. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone.
All right, guys. Thanks. See you guys later.